Welcome back to the Soul Potential CEO podcast. And today I am very excited to have a special guest. We are talking to Jared T. Ross. He is a propaganda consultant, ex MBA professor, and designer of the Cult operating system. And he's here to talk to us about his journey in business. So thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. We got some unpopular but very powerful things to get into today.
I can't wait. So, my first question is, what is a propaganda consultant?
Excellent question. We first need to identify the difference between marketing and propaganda. Most people, when they hear that term propaganda, they get triggered. They think of politics, wartime, Nazis, even. When you start actually studying the world of propaganda, you start to realize how close marketing and propaganda are. And sometimes it's really in the eye of the beholder. But here is the very simple distinction between the two. Marketing is the organized effort to sell a product or service. Propaganda is the organized effort to sell a narrative or an idea. So neither of those, propaganda or marketing, necessarily requires anything dark or unethical or manipulative or any misinformation. Yet both often contain those elements depending on the person wielding those tools. So when I say I'm a propaganda consultant, what I do is I help businesses figure out what is the underlying narrative or idea or belief system that they have to sell to their target audience before it ever makes sense for them to spend money on their products or services.
Why is this a game changer or revolutionary in the marketing space? Because I found you through the Cult operating system. And as someone personally who I just don't buy into the notion that cults are right or wrong. I actually have always viewed them as excellent marketing study. And so when I saw your offer, I thought, oh, that's brilliant. I've been watching cults and and saying, I even joke, I'm like, oh, I'm about to watch this cult documentary and get some marketing tips. And people will go, oh my God, how horrible. And I'm like, what? You're not going to sell me on something that I don't buy into. That's my choice. Like, I'm not under attack by concepts in general. I like to watch patterns. So I loved that you came out with that frame. And I think it's actually a really great in your face way to look at the ways that we buy into powerlessness as business owners and not utilize narratives or what works in an ethical way. And I'm sure that you've had a job of explaining this to people in your work.
Absolutely. So the cult operating system is one small part, one small step within my broader propaganda strategy framework. And this process of building out your own cult operating system for your business basically gives your brand or your business or your community a lot more vibrancy and makes people actually want to be involved, makes people want to spend money with you and be happy to spend money with your business because it gives them that sense of belonging. And this is nothing new. This is what big businesses are doing all the time. It's why people call CrossFit a cult, or Peloton, the in-home bikes, they call them a cult, or Apple users a cult. People use that term usually just to say, oh, well, I don't like them. I don't fit in with them, right? Obviously, there's plenty of, traditional understandings of the word cult and groups of people who are very harmful to themselves or to others. And that's not what the cult operating system is about. It's about building that loyal fan base. It's based on and inspired by cults, cultures, and religions throughout history. Notice how nobody has anything bad to say about cultures, right? You talk
Mhm.
about someone's personal culture, it's something that you have to respect. But as soon
Mhm.
as you cut off that end of the word and it just becomes cult, now everyone's like, let's attack them. When it's just a culture, all the same.
Mhm.
Some cultures are going to be more conducive to progressing humanity forward than others. And I'm
Mhm.
here to help people build out those cults, or at least the cult operating systems that will advance their business and humanity forward.
Tell me about your journey in business. How did you arrive to the place where you realized that this is the positioning that you wanted to take in your work?
I've been an entrepreneur my entire life. going back to 7 years old with the lemonade stands. And so it's always been me trying different things, figuring different things out. And what I found was I'm incredibly skilled at teaching, at taking concepts that are confusing, complex, and boiling them down to their core principles and explaining that in a way where people not only understand, but have an actionable roadmap to move forward and apply these things to their business. And so I've done so many different online businesses. And what I always come back to is whatever online business I'm trying, people always say that they love my marketing. They love how I'm positioning myself, how I'm presenting information or ideas. And I've always kind of had this contrarian flavor to me, doing things a little bit differently than other people. And people resonate with that. A lot of times they resonate with people who are willing to say or do things that people are thinking, but they don't want to say out loud. And it's refreshing when someone is willing to do that. For all his antics, Kanye West, for example, is loved in large part because he says things that people may be thinking, but are far too terrified to actually speak out on. Right. And
Mm.
then some things he says that nobody but him agrees with. But nonetheless, that's why he's so polarizing, is because he's willing to say those unpopular things that people think and feel, but don't say out loud. And so now I'm operating in that same space. And my journey into cults, cultures, religions, and propaganda all actually stemmed from a good friend that I had who I observed was doing things and spending money on things that he didn't actually like, believe in, or care for at all. And he was participating in all of this stuff because it was part of his culture. And I would look there dumbfounded. I'm like, why would you spend money on this? Why would you spend your, a whole week doing this stuff that you don't actually believe in? And he would just say, it's part of my culture. I'm like, so? I'm like, so it was hard for me to process and understand why he would just go and do those things despite it not actually being aligned. And it was simply because it was the way his culture, his cult operating system was set up for his group of people. And he was still happy to do those things. And so that kind of sparks me on this journey of analyzing why people were willing to commit themselves to these things that they might not actually believe in just because it provided a sense of belonging or just because it was part of their culture. It was just the way things were. Started studying cults, built out the cult operating system. And then from there, I started studying this concept of propaganda, wondering why people were so afraid of that word and why our military in the US is still using it, and militaries and governments all around the world are using this, why they're still using it. And what I found is it can be a lot more ethical than you might think.
What would you have to say to somebody who doesn't understand the concept of propaganda as a marketing position? How would you explain that to give them insight or like simple, oh, like make that connection, right? Between what they're already doing and what they're not doing, which would actually work for them.
I'd start with a story. And one of my favorite examples of propaganda in practice goes back to the 1920s in the United States. There was the American Tobacco Company. And in the time, in the 20s, it was very taboo for women to be seen in public smoking cigarettes. It was simply unacceptable. It was social suicide if a woman was doing that in public. And so the tobacco companies, not just this particular one, but all tobacco companies had a very important problem to solve. And they needed to get their product in the hands of more women because they were missing out on almost half the market. And so marketing, right? If we approach that from a marketing approach, the standard would be, okay, more advertising dollars. Let's put some cigarettes in the hands of some female celebrities, right? But this company hired the man who's considered the godfather of modern propaganda or public relations, Edward Bernays. They hired this man, and instead of just approaching it from a marketing perspective, more ad spend, more product placement, he launched a propaganda campaign because he knew he needed to challenge the prevailing cultural narrative at the time. So here's what he did. The Macy's Day Parade was coming up in the United States, a massive parade. All eyes were on it. And in this parade, he hired women suffragettes who were, fighting for women's rights. He hired a group of them to stage a protest. And in this protest, they would storm the parade and they would light up cigarettes during the parade. And not only that, but he also tipped off the press that this is going to be happening.
Oh
So
my
everyone was
God.
there to capture the moment. And then the newspapers ran with the headline that he created, Torches of Freedom. So,
So not only were they smoking, but they were doing it to set themselves free.
Mhm. So now the cigarette became not a taboo thing to shy away from, but a way for women to take back the power from the man to say, I'm in control. This is my body. I'm going to light my torch of freedom. And he basically attached the entire tobacco industry, not just that company. This is a very important distinction. Most propaganda campaigns don't focus on a particular company, they focus on the product category or the entire market. And then it's the concept of a rising tide raises all boats.
Right.
So that's what he did. He attached a cultural narrative that was gaining momentum, women's rights, and he latched on with the industry that he was hired to help promote. And that opened up the whole market for these tobacco companies. And that's the difference in practice between marketing and propaganda.
That is such an incredible story. I loved hearing that story, and it led me to the question that I want to ask, which I think you might have a lot to share on. What would you say about identity and outrage? So I'm talking about the things that we get really amped up about when we don't understand the way that narratives move, especially connected to propaganda and the examples that you're using here. How do you position yourself to be powerful and leading within all of the distortion possible because of the different narratives that people are spinning?
It is a tough one, especially when the narrative that I'm spinning is very easy to attack because a lot of people aren't going to read past the headlines that I put out. So it's challenging to position something as contrarian and unpopular as, hey, propaganda is a viable and necessary business strategy. The way that I'm overcoming that is is by building what I call a narrative anchor. And all propaganda campaigns need something like this. Your narrative anchor is usually a singular source of truth that you can point to say, hey, if anyone's asking, how do I know what you're saying is true? You can just point to this one thing. Sometimes it could be a documentary. Sometimes it could be a white paper or simply a sales page of some sort, but just one source of truth. Because when people start challenging your narrative that you're trying to push out, you need to say, hey, I got all the evidence compiled for you right here. So rather than going back and forth and fighting with people, you just say, hey, go right here and you can argue with yourself against all the evidence I've collected for my narrative.
And do you offer that as a resource in your world?
I do. I'm building mine out right now. So currently, my narrative anchor for my overall propaganda narrative is the cult operating system, but I'm actually producing a documentary on the history, present, and future of the world of propaganda. And then that's going to be my narrative anchor moving forward.
Yeah, that'll be huge because having a video to watch or a documentary, a series of education that kind of nips in the butt all of the different ways that our minds start challenging what you are attempting to explain to people is a really powerful tool.
Yeah. And sometimes you have to go another layer deeper than what your narrative is and
Mm.
explain it in a slightly different way or approach it from a slightly different way. So, one of the angles that I'm going to be approaching it is not just promoting propaganda as a concept and as a business strategy, but educating people on propaganda so they can protect themselves when they see it out in the world. I'm not only talking about using propaganda, I'm also talking about understanding and protecting yourself from it by just learning more about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Like equipping yourself against the narratives that kind of spin the resistance in the first place. Because what I've found is that when people find something to stand against, it gives their identity a lot of fuel, and it almost feeds into this sense of self-importance or self like, it props up your inner state of power because you have something to say no to. But what I often muse about is that the things that we're saying no to sometimes aren't even coming from truth in the first place. It kinda goes back to your example about your friend. It's like, why would you get so invested personally in standing against something if you don't even know what you stand for or why you're doing what you're doing to begin with? And I think in business, a lot of people struggle with this. We have an idea of what we want to say in the world, what we're passionate about, how we want to serve, but we haven't really done the work to go really deep, deep, deep into the why or how to get people on board to hear that conversation. I think when it comes to marketing, we think that we're just supposed to sell and we're supposed to explain and we're supposed to execute on offers, etc. And that can be a really exhausting pursuit if you're not aligned in all of the interworkings of how that operates. So I imagine that the propaganda consulting really helps people get under the hood of that and create a compelling
Yeah.
system. Yeah.
Yeah. What happens is today marketing changes so fast.
Mm,
And then when those changes happen and a business owner or a marketer wasn't expecting it, they're left scrambling, trying to figure out how to pivot their messaging, how to, what platform do I need to be on? When you have a propaganda strategy as the foundation of all of your marketing, it becomes a lot easier to maintain your consistency of messaging, to maintain your overall strategy, and make sure that you have a backup plan for how to pivot as the world of marketing changes. It gives you that confidence and clarity for your brand for the next decade. Once you figure out what your true narrative is, and
mm.
again, your narrative will stand completely separate from your brand name and product. It should be about your product category, it should be about your industry, not so much about your particular business.
Where do you see things moving in the industry? Like, I know you have your eye on the future of marketing, and I know that you're positioning propaganda as being immune to those changes in some ways. So, what are you looking at right now?
I'm looking at the different ways that artificial intelligence will allow propaganda strategies to propagate in different industries a lot faster and a lot easier. So there's this overall guiding philosophy that made me so interested in propaganda in the first place. And it's the quote, the future of public opinion is the future of civilization.
Mm,
And so the way that you control that public opinion is through propaganda.
yep.
And so it's not just the future of propaganda or public relations that I'm interested in. I'm interested in the future of the world, which necessarily means I ought to be interested in propaganda.
Yeah, yeah. What do you have to say about quote unquote ethical standards in this work? How do you speak to that when people automatically react in a way that accuses or assumes that you're attempting to, or somebody else might be attempting to control their mind?
I usually start by asking them to define propaganda.
Yeah.
And then
And they can't.
they usually stumble and then they eventually like, okay, let me just look it up. They pull it up and then they find a definition that is a lot more neutral than they initially thought. Now, obviously, it'll say, usually in the definition on Google, it'll say often including misinformation or biased information sharing.
Mm.
And I'm like, biased information sharing, that's all marketing. It's necessarily going to be biased because if you're marketing your business, you're biased for your business. You're not going to
Yeah.
start a whole bunch of
You
bad
believe
stuff.
in yourself, so you're biased.
Exactly. So they start looking at it and they're like, oh, okay. Well, that actually makes sense. So almost everybody that I've spoken to about propaganda versus marketing say, oh, that actually makes sense. It's when I have a conversation with somebody in a particular context that might trigger them, like religion.
Mm.
Oftentimes, if I try to bring propaganda and equate that to some religious teachings, then they get mad, right? But for most people, when they're not triggered about it and they have an open mind and they're willing to look at the proof in front of them, people are like, oh, yeah, that actually makes sense. I never thought about it like that. So when I go around telling people I'm a propaganda consultant, everyone perks up and they're like, oh, what do you do exactly? What does that entail?
What would you say to somebody who is struggling with clarity or messaging or gaining momentum or traction in their business?
I would ask them plainly, what is the one thing that your ideal customer must believe in order to make your business an undeniable contender for their money? As another example, in modern times on TikTok, charcoal face masks have gone viral a number of times. Right. So the narrative there that people have to convince their people of is that charcoal face masks are going to be the difference maker for your skincare and are better than all these other ways that you've ever tried. That's the narrative, right? It's not attached to your brand, it's attached to that product category of charcoal face masks. That's the
Mhm.
narrative that you have to push. And a lot of people get so centered on, well, let me just push my brand, my product, rather than focusing on educating people on your narrative. Because when you educate someone on your narrative and then they come to conviction on your narrative because of your content, it would make absolute sense for them to go ahead and spend that money with you because you were the one who convicted them on that particular narrative. And what I find is most people have no idea what their narrative is.
Yep. Yep. 100%. I think because we think, and I'm even relating this back to myself, I can see this in my own journey and in the way that I position my own brand. I think that a lot of business advice really talks about the importance of building up brand awareness. And therefore, we think that we have to talk about what our brand is, who our brand is. And then we also intertwine that with a personal brand. So we make it about us, right? So then we're always looking at like, well, who are we? And then we're moving away from, like you said, that conviction point because you can't necessarily ask someone fully to buy into you, right? As a brand or as a person. Um, if you want to build a business that will scale beyond you as a person, right?
Mhm. There's another fun story that I read in some book. I forget which it was, but there was a piano company who wanted to sell more pianos. And so they hired somebody to come in as their propagandist. And rather than just doing what marketing would do, is like put some more ads, let's run Facebook, Instagram ads for our pianos. Let's have these famous people playing our pianos. What they set out to do was popularize this concept of music rooms in rich people's homes. Music rooms becoming a status symbol, saying you're not really that rich and elite. You don't have a music room in your house. And so now celebrities are like, okay, I need to get a music room. I got this spare room anyways in my mansion. So let me turn it into a music room. But now I got to put all these instruments in there. I need music to be in my music room. And so naturally, one of those biggest instruments that you can use to fill up some of that space is a piano. And because that company was the one popularizing the concept of music rooms and, showing different ways to configure and set them up, the essentials you need for your music room, now their piano sales started bumping up.
Amazing. Is building propaganda a slower build in your business that is absolutely worth it? I can see that. But I'm starting to think about, I know that I found you through a Facebook ad, and I know that you were measured in how you chose to build up a community and build up a tool and then build up, like, I feel like you really plan ahead and kind of think through the steps where a lot of people get very frustrated very quickly. Can you talk about your thoughts on that?
Sure. So building out a propaganda strategy for your business is what allows you to see those steps coming ahead. Because propaganda isn't just your underlying narrative, it's not just supportive of your marketing. It also helps you design what your customer journey is going to be like. And there's a specific exercise in building out your propaganda strategy using my framework where you do actually draw out a line and you plot the customer journey. And that's
Mhm.
incredibly helpful for planning ahead for products and services that you can offer to help people get value from your business. And so, yes, to answer your question, it is well worth it building it out because it can literally set you up for the next decade
Mm.
of having crystal clarity on what you're talking about. And so, no matter what platforms or technologies come and go, you
Yep.
still have your propaganda strategy to fall back on. And it's something that is going to be nearly timeless for you and your business. So, it's not just advised, it's essential. And how long does it take to build out? Well, it depends on the scope and scale of it because there's
Right.
certain parts of building out your strategy you can get done today, literally just figuring out, hey, what's my narrative? Because a lot of businesses are already kind of operating with an underlying narrative or maybe a couple that they're not consciously aware of. And
Right.
then others have no narrative at all. A lot of times people who are trying to start clothing brands, for example, have no narrative. They don't know what their true underlying narrative is. But there are others who do have inherent narratives that they're just not consciously aware of. So it sometimes get misconstrued in marketing material. So you can figure that aspect out within a day in some cases. Other times it'll take you a couple days, but for the vast majority of building out your framework, because content strategy is involved, building out your omnipresent strategy, reaching out to media outlets if it's relevant. That all can take, a few weeks, but spending a few weeks to set yourself up for the next decade is well worth it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Well, tell me one little bit of your secret sauce that you want listeners to walk away with.
Mm. I think I already gave it in that question that I posed earlier. Every business owner should be asking themselves, what is the one thing my ideal client must believe in order to make my business an undeniable contender for their money? You walk away from this podcast with that alone, and it's going to start giving you a whole lot more clarity. And your narrative, right? Answering that question will give you your narrative. That alone, it should be about a sentence, maybe two, can guide you for the next few years in your business. Now, something else that I'll borrow from the cult operating system is you need to identify what your conflict is going to be or who your conflict is going to be with. It doesn't have to be a person or a group of people, it can be a concept. So you
Mhm.
need to identify for your brand, for your narrative, what is the enemy of that? And now you have a totally different angle for your marketing that you can use. So you have your propaganda narrative, right? That's reinforcing your narrative. And then you have your antithesis or your conflict. And that's a different angle that you can attack with saying, hey, we all don't like this concept over here. Let's make sure we don't fall into that by doing this. And then you
Mm.
talk about your propaganda narrative. And then one final piece would be to identify your brand archetype. And this is also part of the cult operating system, but this concept of the 12 brand archetypes is not from me. It's from other psychologists. And so you need to identify which of the 12 brand archetypes, you can just Google it and you'll find, resources on it. Which of the 12 brand archetypes fit your brand and fit your ideal client? Because once you have that, you have more backup and foundation for your entire marketing strategy for the next decade.
Amazing. This was so good. Thank you so much. Talk to me about what you're working on and where people can find you.
I am Jared T. Ross on all platforms. And right now, the two biggest things that I'm working on is building out a propaganda organization where literally what we're going to be doing is documenting and cataloging some of the top propaganda campaigns in
Mm.
history and just giving that away as a resource for people. Of course, my propaganda documentary, which will be coming out probably this summer. And then I have my private community called Future Proof Marketers. Inside Future Proof Marketers, you're getting basically everything I know, right? So I'm just constantly adding more and more training material, courses, and content inside of this community, as well as biweekly coaching calls. And Future Proof Marketers is really for you if you know that your business is solid, you are already generating some money with it, you have proof of concept, but you're tired of trying to figure out your marketing so much and you want
Yep.
something reliable to count on and you want a resource to go to where you can get live coaching and help with all of your marketing problems. What it does is it removes those barriers that you're experiencing and you always end up knowing what you need to do next and knowing
Yep.
exactly how to do what you are supposed to be doing next. It's called Future Proof Marketers because it's designed to future proof your marketing so that you don't have to rely on changing algorithms or different platforms. It's all coming together inside of Future Proof Marketers, including training on propaganda.
I love it. Thank you so, so much for being here. It was such a pleasure to talk to you. And I hope if you enjoyed listening to this, that you check out the links in the show notes and see how you can follow Jared and watch his content and learn even more about how to create a powerful narrative in your brand and business. Thank you so much, Jared.
Thank you.